Think about the last time you sat down to watch a movie at home. You probably grabbed a remote, scrolled through a menu, and hit play, the whole thing invisible, effortless, almost thoughtless. But there was a time, not that long ago really, when watching a film in your own living room was either impossible or a minor miracle. The story of how we got from there to here is one of the great forgotten chapters of American consumer culture, full of corporate warfare, basement inventors, failed gambles, and millions of ordinary families who just wanted to watch something good on a Friday night. It starts, like so many things in post-war America, with Kodak. In the early 1950s, Kodak released affordable 8mm film cameras and projectors aimed squarely at the American middle class. For the first time, families could document their own lives, birthdays, vacations, the kids running through a sprinkler in the backyard, and then project those moments onto a white sheet hung in the living room. It was intimate and a little magical, and it became a genuine American ritual. But there was a catch: these were home movies, not Hollywood movies. The footage was silent, grainy, and short. If you wanted to watch an actual feature film in your house, you needed a 16mm or even a 35mm projector setup, and that kind of equipment was so expensive that only the genuinely wealthy could afford it. For most Americans in 1955, watching a Hollywood picture meant getting in the car, buying a ticket, and going to a theater. There was no other way. That began to change in the mid-1970s, when two competing technologies arrived on the American market within a year of each other and proceeded to wage one of the most consequential commercial battles in the history of consumer electronics. In 1975, Sony introduced the Betamax. A year later, JVC answered with VHS. On paper, Betamax had the edge, sharper picture, tighter engineering, a more polished feel. Sony was proud of it, and they had every reason to be. But JVC had figured out something that Sony hadn't fully appreciated yet. American consumers didn't just want quality. They wanted convenience. They wanted to take the Sunday game and watch it Monday night. They wanted to record a movie while the family was out and sit down with it after dinner. And VHS, right out of the box, could record 2 hours of footage. Betamax, in its early form, gave you only one. That single difference, 1 hour versus 2, proved decisive. Not because of engineering, not because of picture quality, but because of how real people actually used the technology in the flow of their real lives. By the early 1980s, VHS had effectively won. Betamax lingered on for years, a cult favorite among videophiles, with the rental shelves at your local video store, and every strip mall in America seemed to have one by then, or stocked almost entirely with VHS tapes. The format war was over, but while that battle was playing out on the living room floor, another one was happening in Washington. Hollywood was terrified of the VCR. The Motion Picture Association of America lobbied Congress aggressively, warning that consumers recording television broadcasts off the air would destroy the film industry. They wanted chips installed in every VCR to block that capability. They framed it as a piracy crisis, an existential threat. What they were really wrestling with, though we can see this clearly now, was the same anxiety that every established entertainment industry faces when consumers suddenly gain control over how and when they watch things. The lobbying ultimately failed. The courts sided with consumers. And the irony that followed was almost comic. Within a few years, home video sales and rentals became one of Hollywood's most lucrative revenue streams. The thing they'd fought against turned into a gold mine. Now, while all of this was happening with VHS and Betamax, there was a third format that most people have either forgotten or never knew about, and it matters because it quietly changed everything that came after. LaserDisc arrived in the late 1970s and it was, in purely technical terms, extraordinary. The picture was sharper than anything VHS could produce. The audio was richer. You could skip directly to any scene rather than rewinding a tape, and the format introduced something genuinely new to home video: special features, director's commentaries, behind-the-scenes footage, supplemental content that invited you to think about filmmaking itself. Everything we now take for granted on a DVD or a Blu-ray was first developed and refined on LaserDisc. The problem was the disc itself, about the size of a vinyl record, nearly half a pound, and if you wanted to watch a 2-hour film, you had to get up at the midpoint and physically flip it over. It also never got cheap. LaserDisc was a format for enthusiasts, for the dedicated film lover who had the shelf space, the money, and the patience. It never became the family entertainment format its creators had hoped for. But its DNA, the optical disc format, the digital audio encoding, the very idea of interactive chapter navigation, ran directly forward into every format that followed. LaserDisc was the foundation that DVD was built on, even if almost nobody outside of a certain kind of home theater devotee ever owned one. The DVD arrived in 1995 and it was a different story entirely. Where LaserDisc had been elegant but impractical, DVD was elegant and ruthlessly convenient. The discs were small enough to slip into a coat pocket. They were more durable than tapes, which wore down with every play. They could hold interactive menus, multiple audio tracks, subtitles in a dozen languages, and special features that could fill a second disc entirely. And crucially, they were cheap to produce, which meant they were cheap to buy and cheap to rent. DVD adoption moved faster than almost any consumer technology in American history. The family that had been renting VHS tapes on a Friday night found themselves buying their favorite movies to own, building little libraries on shelves that gradually took over entire walls of the living room. There was one brief, strange challenger to DVD in those early years, a format called DivX, not the video codec but a separate physical disc system released in 1998. DivX discs were sold cheaply, but they weren't yours. They expired after 48 hours of first viewing unless you paid an additional fee. To unlock them for extended viewing, your player had to dial up a service through a phone modem. The whole thing was premised on a pay-per-view model dressed up in physical media clothing, and it lasted less than a year. Consumers rejected it decisively. The idea that you would buy something and still not own it, that you would pay for the disc, pay for the viewing, and have the content disappear when someone else decided it should, struck the American public as exactly the kind of deal you don't make. It was, in retrospect, a preview of arguments we'd be having again 2 decades later. DVD sales climbed steadily through the late 1990s and then, for reasons that had nothing to do with the technology itself, they spiked dramatically in the early 2000s. The September 11th attacks reshaped American consumer behavior in ways that are easy to forget now. People pulled inward. They stayed home. They invested in their domestic spaces in a way they hadn't before, and home entertainment was part of that. DVD players, home theater systems, big widescreen televisions, the living room became, for a lot of American families, a place worth spending serious money on, which made it all the more significant when, around the mid-2000s, those widescreen televisions started getting dramatically better. High-definition television changed the visual standard for the American home, and DVD, which had looked so sharp compared to VHS, suddenly looked soft and limited on a 50-inch LCD screen. The industry needed a new format, and once again, 2 of them arrived simultaneously. Toshiba came with HD DVD in 2006. Sony came with Blu-ray. Sound familiar? A second format war, almost 20 years after the first one, playing out in the same living rooms, on the same shelves, in the same electronics stores. This time around, the decisive move wasn't about recording time or picture quality, it was about the PlayStation 3. Sony built Blu-ray directly into the PS3, which meant that every household where a teenager was clamoring for the new gaming console was also getting a Blu-ray player. Xbox 360 owners who wanted HD DVD had to buy a separate external drive. The math was simple, and it resolved quickly. By 2008, Toshiba had conceded. Blu-ray had won, but Blu-ray's reign brought with it a set of frustrations that quietly eroded goodwill between studios and the dedicated consumers who had, for decades, been their most loyal customers. Restoring older films for high definition required real investment, scanning original film negatives frame by frame, correcting color, removing decades of accumulated damage. Classics that had been shot on magnificent 35mm film could be brought back to something close to their original visual splendor, and some studios did that work beautifully. But the business model that grew up around it had a particular quality that collectors found maddening. Studios learned that the same movie, re-released in a new edition with slightly different packaging, a bonus disc, or a restored transfer, could be sold again to people who had already bought it twice before. The industry called it double dipping, and in some cases triple dipping, and it was a calculated bet that a certain kind of dedicated fan would keep buying. Some did. Others grew exhausted by it, and the exhaustion left a mark. The format also produced its own version of the DivX problem, not in its basic design, but in the way studios handled exclusive content. A film might be released with one set of bonus features at Target, a different set at Best Buy, and a digital version with entirely different extras on iTunes. To get the complete picture, you had to buy multiple versions of the same movie. For fans who remembered the early DVD era, when studios had seemed almost genuinely enthusiastic about giving you everything they had, this felt like a betrayal. Not a dramatic one. Just a slow, grinding acknowledgement that the relationship between consumer and studio was more transactional than anyone had quite admitted before. And then, Quietly and then all at once, the physical format era began to end. There's a story, almost too on the nose to be true, that Blockbuster Video, once the undisputed empire of home entertainment rental in America, with stores on what felt like every third corner in every city in the country, had an opportunity to acquire a small DVD by mail company called Netflix in the early 2000s and passed. The price being discussed was around $50 million. Blockbuster said no. You know how the rest goes. Streaming replaced rental. Netflix, then Hulu, then Amazon, then Disney, then a dozen others, offered to put essentially everything on a server and let you watch it on whatever screen you happened to be looking at. The discs began to gather dust, and yet something was lost in that transition, and it's worth naming honestly. Streaming is convenient in a way that nothing before it has been. But it is also, in fundamental ways, not ownership. The studio or the service can remove a title at any time. The compression that makes streaming practical also degrades the image and the audio compared to what a high-quality Blu-ray disc can deliver, subtly in some cases, significantly in others. And the catalog of what's available shifts constantly, governed by licensing agreements and corporate priorities that have nothing to do with what you might want to watch on a particular evening. What started with a Kodak projector and a sheet hung in the living room, and moved through format wars and rental stores and the particular Friday night pleasure of wandering the aisles until something caught your eye, has arrived at a place where the content is everywhere and the ownership is essentially nowhere. Whether that's progress depends entirely on what you think the point was.